Welcome back to Metropolis. Our new segment may be titled Hello Good Byline. Today, I'm joined by a fellow journalist, Aude. How are you doing today, Aude?
I'm good, and you?
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for asking. So, what has been on your radar, Aude?
This weekend with you, I attended a counter-protest to the 1 million March for Children protest. So this has been on my radar. It was interesting to see. It's the second protest that's been done since September. And yeah, just to give you a little context, basically the 1 million March for Children is a movement of parents and individuals who want sex and gender education to be eliminated of schools. So basically they are saying that this is a gateway to indoctrination as well as the harm of children. And yeah, we went this weekend, and basically one of their core demand is that sexual orientation and gender identity is eliminated from the curriculum, as well as pronouns, the use of pronouns, gender diverse bathroom, and gender ideology, because they fear that children will lose their innocence if they are if they are exposed to that content.
Right. I feel like these protesters, the million marchers, they don't find that school is the place for this kind of education.
Exactly.
To them, I think these kinds of social things should not be taught in schools. I remember the protest we went to Saturday. Now it was a bit of a rainy day, but decent turnout. I think there was around 500 people on the trans rights side, and then the million marchers started off with like 5, but then around noon they were at like
80 people, I would say.
80 to 100 people. Yeah, that sounds about right.
It was very different from the first protest, which was on September 20th, and we actually have a clip of the first protest, so we can just show it.
Let's watch that.
Yeah.
Intense.
Yeah.
Intense.
I would say this one, without seeming insensitive, that this one was more of a yelling match between the two sides.
The original one.
Yeah, the original one on September 20th, while the one on October 21st was more of, counter-protesters gathering to block off the access that protesters wanted to have to the Office of Education.
Do you think they were successful in wanting to block them off?
I think they were, and I think we also have a clip for that, so I think we can actually show people watching a clip of, how it was.
Perfect. Yeah. So yeah, I guess what was the word you used to describe this protest?
I mean,
the atmosphere.
The atmosphere, the energy was more, I wouldn't say like a party per se, but it was more of a, gathering where people were just like talking, having fun, dancing as well, as you saw on the screen. Just, it was more of a celebration, I guess, of like, queer identity than, being there to...
Do you think dancing has a place at protests?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I think protesting can take many, many forms, and I think dancing is one of them. And the part in this protest, like dancing, the point of it was to just show that they were happy to be there, and that that they wouldn't let protesters actually take the space, and kind of go back in time with like the education that children should be able to have, or the safe space they should be able to have in schools.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I know after the September 20th protests, so that one, if you recall, it started off with the trans rights counter protests being outnumbering the initial million marchers. But then we saw as the day progressed, the million marchers eventually swelled in numbers. I think it was something like 900, and there are only a few hundred of the counter protesters. I remember speaking to some of the counter protesters. They seem to feel incredibly demoralized. Right. I remember speaking to them. They were like talking about how this was kind of a bit of a gut punch, seeing so many people turn out for like parental rights, against trans rights, or against gender inclusive education in schools. And I guess to me, when I see this kind of celebration, this kind of a bit more of a joyous attitude, it seems almost like a response to that kind of how demoralized they were last time. I spoke to some of the protesters at the protest on Saturday, the trans rights ones. And I think some people, I'm kind of curious as to your take on this. Some of the organizers, some of the people attending the trans rights protests seem to have a bit of an issue with how they were going about, I guess, the language they were using against the million marchers. Like, I think you saw, right? They're calling them like fascists. They're calling them like "go back home" fascists was one of the chants. And I remember, I think something I think we both saw at both protests was that there's kids present, right? So it's like, I don't know, what do you make of that? Calling like having kids on one side and having, like, let's say like the trans rights protesters on the other side, and them using the language, them calling the kids' families fascists. I know. So in these protest groups, I think some people there's been this communique passed around that like they should be more careful with their language and how they address like families and kids. I'm kind of curious what you make of that.
Yeah, this is a big question.
It really is. It really is. How much time do we have?
But I would say the thing is, I don't think any of the counter protesters are actually addressing the kids.
Right.
Because obviously most of the kids that were there did not understand why they were there, and they were just accompanying their parents. So it's more so about, the parents, what they're standing up for. And I think that, of course, it's very, very, very heavy language, but I think also like the way they might have thought about it is that, using such heavy language is what it might make people stop for a second and see what they're truly standing up for.
Right.
Because, for example, like things that like some of the counter protesters talked about is that, one of them in the first protest talked about how if they wouldn't have had like support to understand their own gender identity, and like or would have not found other people who were also not in the binary of gender, as people say, they would have probably died a long time ago. So for a lot of people on the counter protest side, it's a matter of life or death, because if you don't have the support, and if you think you grew up thinking that what you are is not normal, not conventional, or you don't find that you have the support from your own parents that are supposed to love you unconditionally, like it could lead to death, or like things like that.
Of course, it is a serious thing you're saying. So the serious language matches the serious tone of the.
I think that's how the counter protesters saw it, because to them it's not just like this moment in particular. Is that, for example, if education on gender identity and sexual orientation is not taught, or it's like removed from schools, how long is it going to be before it's reintroduced to schools? And if we start with one right being revoked, how many other rights are going to be revoked? So I think that this is how they actually saw the issue, and this is why such language was used. But I can also say that, as you brought up earlier, that heavy language was also used on the other side as well.
Of course.
Associations were made to queerness and like pedophilia in the chants. So like it's very. Yeah, it's a very.
So I guess why do you think they make that kind of association from their perspective?
I think there's a big history behind the association of pedophilia and homosexuality, because homosexuality was seen as a mental illness years and years ago, and pedophilia was also seen as a mental illness, and still is by many people as well. So I think that because I think a connection people often make to sexual orientation is that it's sexual attraction. Well, it is sexual attraction in a sense, but because they find that there is a sexual attraction aspect to pedophilia, they think it all goes in the same thing. Bless you.
Thank you.
So yeah, they kind of put the two together. Like they see that it has to do with sexuality and sexual attraction. So they think that if, someone being queer has to do well in terms of lesbian, romantically speaking, or gay, romantically speaking, bisexual, romantically speaking, and all those stuff by romantic, pan-romantic, then it means that since pedophilia is, they think that this is sexual attraction as well. So they
That's a
both
connection, right?
kind of go in the same, basket.
Right.
Which is why I think they use that language.
That's interesting. It's going to be interesting seeing how these unfold. If there's going to be more protests. I have another sneeze coming in.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Bless you.
Gotta get an air purifier in here. Anything else you wanted to talk about?
Not that I can think of.
All right, terrific. Thank you very much, Aude.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Of course. All right. We'll be back. Welcome back to Hello Good Byline. We have Adrian back here. Adrian, you wanted to clarify something about how the counter-protesters were questioning the use of the word fascist. Could you go into that for me?
Yeah, so a lot in both of the protests, the kind of, specifically the line, fascists go home, has been used by the trans rights protesters against the 1 million March protesters. And I think the main thing that some people are upset about is this kind of language of telling people, especially to go home, because many of the people on the Million March side, these anti-trans and anti-queer protesters, are predominantly are in large population non-white. A good proportion are immigrants too, and so kind of reusing that language that is often used to tell people just literally go home, we don't want you out on the street, is the same language has been used to tell immigrants to go back where you came from. And so when you're using that kind of language against a different group, it's maybe not as effective. And I think a lot of people were also found that sometimes there was assumptions based on race that someone was on a certain side. If someone wasn't very definitively on one side, if someone was coming in a bit late, then some people were not being super welcoming on the queer rights side.
Right. Because they would assume, this person sort of looks like they could be Muslim from the Middle East, so they're likely on the other side, so they'd be kind of... Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing that.
Yeah, no problem.
Right. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Metropolis. On Hello Good Byline, today we have Savanna.
Hi.
How are you doing, Savanna?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Excellent. Thank you for asking. What's been on your radar?
I have been attending a lot of pro-Palestine demonstrations. I've been at quite a few. I know you've been at some too, but the first one I attended was one on October 11th. It was outside of Norman Bethune Square, which is just a block away from the CUTV studios. And essentially it was a small gathering. It was not really an official protest, but I think that's the first one I attended when, kind of pro-Palestine activism had been ramping up in Montreal since October 7th.
Your coverage of that blew up on TikTok, I believe.
Yeah, it has 3.6 million views. Thank you.
Are you a millionaire now?
No, I profited nothing off of this.
That's great. That's great to know. Sorry, to continue.
Yeah, I think, a point on that, I think people are always quite engaged in that topic. So there's been a lot of comments.
On Palestine?
Yeah, on Palestine. I mean, in that video in particular, it was Rabbi David Feldman, who was speaking about, the state of Israel does not represent Judaism. And, kicking people out of their homes, bombing people, massacring them, like all of these things do not represent the Jewish religion. And he was essentially like denouncing what's going on in Israel. And I think that really stood out to people online, because it's not just, someone who's facing the repercussions of Israel. It's someone who is Jewish themselves and is going out and speaking against Israel, which already I think a lot of people have been ostracized for supporting Palestine, for supporting, the liberation of Palestine. And I think for someone in the Jewish community who could possibly get ostracized, to do that was maybe shocking for people online. And I did see a few comments on this post saying, well, where has he been in the past? He's actually been in a lot of these pro-Palestine protests that I've been at. There was the Nakba Day in May that I attended, and he gave a speech there too. And I've seen him over the years, so he's had quite a presence. But there's been a few other protests that I've been at. On October 13th, there was a massive protest. This was just a couple days after I filmed that speech of Rabbi Feldman, where it started at, again, Norman Bethune Square, and everyone kind of walked until the Israeli consulate, and there was about 10,000 people in attendance. Very large energy. There was fireworks. There were, I don't know what they're called, the kind of smoke
grenades.
Smoke grenades?
Smoke bombs, I think.
Smoke bombs, where it's like colored and releases. People were just very, I think, engaged, and you felt a lot of emotion from the crowd. And, I noticed a lot of non-Palestinian people there as well, who I think just feel very sympathetic to the movement and frustrated that, Canada and the USA and other nations are not just supporting this, but complicit in it with, sending growing military exports each year.
10,000 is a lot. I haven't seen 10,000 at a protest in a long while, I feel.
Huge. You were at this one?
No, I wasn't at the 10,000 person one, no. But I feel like the frequency these protests have been at and the amount of people that show up are always in the thousands. This 10,000 one sounds like the highest one. There was one Sunday which I think must have had like 8,000-9,000 people. I'm not sure what the final count was, but it's I think clearly a sign of where popular will is and what people want. And it's like, I think before you were saying about like the people being ostracized for supporting Palestine. I think it should be clear that like a lot of these people are, what they're calling for is peace. What they're calling for is ceasefires, right? But then that position even seems unamenable to some people, and that people are being fired for calling for a ceasefire even.
I think the reasoning behind that is some people are equating anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism,
Right.
Which can be very dangerous, because I think that in any activist space there can be people who have different points of view. I'm sure that there's even been a case a few weeks ago in Australia where someone at a pro-Palestine protest was, making shouting anti-Semitic comments, which is very unfortunate, and these things shouldn't be happening. But overall, to label a full movement where people are just simply asking for liberation and an end to the occupation, it's kind of being misrepresented. And that actually links to another protest I attended. It was on October 16th. It was actually in Ottawa, outside the Shaw Centre. And the Centre for Israeli and Jewish Affairs, they were hosting a 2-day conference in the Shaw Centre, essentially inviting, people from Israel, Canadian politicians. I believe Jagmeet Singh was there, and protesters, members from Independent Jewish Voices. The Montreal chapter had traveled from Montreal to Ottawa, and they were essentially kind of some of them were doing a sit-in outside the Shaw Center, and others were just kind of, drumming. They had posters chanting across the street. And they were protesting this conference because they were saying that it's equating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and they were essentially saying that this is dangerous, and this allows violence that's going on in Gaza to continue. And yeah, that's mostly what I've been at. I also went last Friday, October 17th. There was a protest outside the U.S. consulate that moved to Legault's office just on Sherbrooke. It's across from McGill University. And they had, again, independent Jewish voices, but this time alongside Palestinian youth movement. They had made kind of like a sit-in semi-barricade outside Legault's office a couple months ago. Quebec had opened its first offices in the Middle East. So it's located in Tel Aviv. And protesters were demanding for Legault to close these offices until a ceasefire is declared, and to also call what's happening in Gaza a genocide.
Wow. So what a time to open an office in Israel. Yeah.
Some people are also saying too that opening an office in Israel is normalizing the occupation.
Right.
So I think that was part of the reasoning to close it, but more for direct action to call for a ceasefire.
Of course, yeah. I remember there was a few years ago, a bit of a stir caused by Trump saying that he was going to move the U.S. embassy into Jerusalem, right? Which is like one of the cities that's like right on the border of the West Bank and Israeli territories.
Yeah, and he did.
Yeah, right. No,
yeah.
he did.
Yeah. I think Palestinian communities are still kind of feeling the repercussion of that normalization of Israel's occupation.
Yeah, a question for you. So how long have you been kind of covering Palestinian activism in Montreal?
Yeah, it's been about 8 years.
8 years, yeah. So I feel it's really great that we have someone, I think, with that kind of like long-term perspective, because I feel like you're kind of privy to these kinds of subtle shifts in like public conversations around it. So I think if we had to kind of go on a more macro view of things, how do you think the conversation has changed? How do you think media coverage of Israel-Palestine is changing now compared to, let's say, like 8 years ago when you began covering it?
That's a good question.
Thank you.
I think that it's a similar narrative to what I've seen over the past 8 years, but it's intensified each time. I think when I say narrative, I want to kind of call out certain words that are used. Like you'll see some publications say this number of Palestinians died while this amount of Israelis were killed.
Right.
And it's kind of like this active language that's, these Israelis were killed by someone. Someone murdered them.
It creates like a murderer, someone who was like directly responsible for the death, where death alone is just kind of like
died.
The
it
trail,
just happened.
the trail of responsibility kind of ends short.
Exactly. And this is language I've seen since I've been reporting, since before then.
So just for clarification, who's using this kind of language? Is it?
More like large media outlets. I see it in the CBC. I see it in Associated Press. I think I've seen kind of smaller, more left-leaning outlets try to be careful about that. I've seen Vice News try to be careful about that. But a lot of the large and, either like national or international outlets where people are probably more likely to go to get their news are reading these kind of terms.
Well, and why do you think that kind of language is important? Why do you think those choices are being made for that kind of the language being used in this coverage?
I think it's important because it does kind of dehumanize Palestinians in a sense of that. I mean, maybe that's my own personal view, dehumanize, but I think that it just doesn't...
How about depersonalize it?
Depersonalize, and I think it doesn't kind of address the root of the violence. The root of the violence is the occupation. And the occupation is causing deaths on both sides. But I think when we're using terms like, 100 Palestinians died, it's just like, I think it's important to be clear in a headline, also in the article itself. But if someone's just reading that, they might kind of think, oh, the natural causes came into play, this or that. Whereas were killed, like I think reading a headline like that, it's like, what is the root cause of this? Like I want to understand.
Who are the killers?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's something that I've noticed more critique over the years, especially since the bombing of Gaza in May 2021. Like, I think that was the first time in my 8 years of reporting that I had seen people start to really criticize this, not just in small communities, but, nationally, internationally, people were talking about the fact that there is such poor coverage towards pro-Palestinian activism, but also violence in Gaza, the West Bank, and anywhere else in Palestine. There is a lot more I want to say on this, but maybe before we continue, we could just play a short clip. This clip is Sarah Boivin. She's a member of Independent Jewish Voices, and this was at the demonstration they held in Ottawa.
Let's check it out.
Jews against genocide, not in our name. Not in our name. Jews against genocide. Palestinians are not our enemy.
This conference is about anti-Semitism, the actions of the Israeli government, oppressing the Palestinian people with bombs, cutting off their electricity and water, bombing their hospitals, and the occupation just breed anti-Semitism. They're not protecting us. It's a very hypocritical concept of what's going on in this conference. It's really about Israel. It's not about anti-Semitism, and we don't believe it for a second.
Strong words. Strong words.
And this kind of links to what you were saying before. This activist, his name is Scott Weinstein. He's a member of Independent Jewish Voices. It was myself and another journalist from the Associated Press that were there for maybe an hour, and then this journalist from CTV showed up, and he was kind of asking questions, and he asked this question that I think has really been emphasized in the media when journalists have the chance to speak with most notably Palestinians, but also, pro-Palestine protestors of other origins, is, can you condemn Hamas? Like, he actually interrupted Scott to ask if he could condemn Hamas. And, obviously Israelis are facing violence. Like 1,000 Israelis were killed on more than 1,000 on October 7th. But it's kind of, the question keeps coming back to, can you condemn Hamas?
Why do you think it keeps coming back to that?
I think that I think that part of it is taking away the power from activists and the narrative that they're trying to promote, which is the occupation of Israel. And I think it's maybe trying to levelize the amount of violence that's going on. Because when you look at statistics of Israeli deaths versus Palestinian deaths over the last 10 years, even more, there are spikes at certain points of Israeli deaths, but overall, like, Palestinians are dying at much greater rates. So I think when people have the platform to call this out and, really pinpoint that the root of harm for Palestinians, but Israelis as well, is the occupation, it kind of comes back to, well, this is a terrorist group. So are you going to denounce them? Is what you're saying, essentially questioning if critiquing the occupation is, is kind of like saying that it's okay for what Hamas did. So I think it's maybe that journalism thing of, we don't use unbiased anymore, but fair and balanced. So trying to get both sides of the story. But I think it's in the approach that a lot of journalists and media outlets have, where it's not just simply asking, "Can you denounce Hamas?" It's the interruption. It's also this kind of introductory question when pro-Palestinian activists or a Palestinian journalist is brought on air, where that's the first question, instead of what's going on in Gaza, like, as a member of the Palestinian diaspora, like, how is this affecting you? Do you have
Right.
family back there? I think
Instead of asking those things, they just want that kind of immediate condemnation.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I understand getting both sides of the story is important, but I also have noticed in a lot of the coverage that I've been consuming internationally, America, Canada, when they invite Israeli officials on or pro-Israel demonstrators, that kind of question isn't returned. Can you denounce the Israeli government? Can you denounce the occupation? That same space isn't being held.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. Well, they allow them to kind of dictate like the pace, the kind of topics covered, where the same kind of generosity is not extended to Palestinian people that they're interviewing. Is that what you're saying?
I think so, and I think it's maybe more so just like the normalization of the occupation, but also just not providing space to critique our own country, to critique American imperialism and how we're complicit and how we're just causing violence from what we export and the laws that we pass and the rhetoric of our own politicians.
I'm kind of wondering. So from your perspective, have you spoken to Montreal Palestinian activists? I'm kind of wondering how are they dealing with all this? How do they feel about such an imbalance in like media approaches to them?
Yeah, frustrated, sad. I think when I have spoken to organizers and I've been at these events, a lot of them are really, really worried about making sure that the protest runs smoothly and that no one is arguing amongst each other. The guidelines of the protest are clearly stated, and just that there's even not any like anti-Semitic rhetoric, because I think that the pro-Palestinian movement is really under a magnifying glass right now.
Of course.
I think often it continuously is, but especially when there's violence in Gaza that creates a kind of wave internationally of affecting other people and condemnation or actions from different politicians. I think it's especially under a lens, but right now I think it really is, and especially when pro-Palestine protests started after October 7th, a lot of media outlets were framing these protests as pro-Hamas. Like even the BBC recently apologized for framing one of the protests and protests in their recent coverage. So I think these groups are being so careful to really make it clear that they're not affiliated with Hamas and they're not uplifting Hamas, but what they're trying to do is uplift Palestinians, liberate Palestinians, end an occupation. This is kind of their focus, and I think a lot of that does stem from this kind of like constant question of, can you condemn Hamas?
How do Palestinian organizers here attempt to end the occupation? How are they, like, let's say, given the distance, right, we have from Palestine, like, I'm wondering, like, what are they doing to try and like leverage that?
Essentially, it's maintaining conversation around it and maintaining education around it. I think having, thousands of people in the streets is is what they see as a form of trying to end the occupation, just kind of the presence. Because even if someone doesn't really know what's going on, if they're seeing thousands in the streets, they're going to be like,
something big's going on.
Something's going on,
Right,
and
of course.
educate themselves. I think also it's a lot of what's going on in social media. There's a lot of misinformation being shared. Also, a lot of kind of takes that are upholding the occupation. So I think it's trying to get the narrative out of people who are living in Gaza and, you know, experiencing this violence. So I think it's a combination of being on the streets, being active, and also just, you know, sharing people's stories, experiences, and, you know, continuing to educate people on what's going on in Gaza.